Hello, and welcome to this review of the QA Financial 2021 Vision series. And I'm joined by Stephen Feloney and Alex Martens of Broadcom, our series sponsor for this session. And Stephen and Alex are going to introduce themselves in a minute. The purpose is really just to discuss some of the topics that arose in that series, which is a series that you can see on demand at qafinancial.com, where over 6 seminars with nearly 30 speakers, we looked at some of the key challenges in automation and AI and other technologies that financial firms are facing in their curve towards DevOps and continuous delivery of software, and some of the potential solutions. Now, we covered a lot of topics. We covered the public cloud, the challenges in transitioning to the public cloud, the challenges that large firms face in achieving simplicity and scale in software development, and the challenge of the increasing complexity of markets and regulatory compliance. And complexity is often a roadblock to automation, we heard. We heard that the management of data for testing, connecting data lakes to test environments, is a key challenge for 2021. Some of our speakers wanted to discuss whether virtualization technologies were the answer, whether they were economic. It's a big issue, which we can talk about here today. And finally, of course, COVID has been a big topic of discussion. It's accelerated demand for digital services from customers. But it's also highlighted some of the challenges that financial firms face, for example, in performance testing, which many of them still find difficult. We've seen many examples of that. So I want to start, Stephen, with you, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself. And I think a good place to start was the session that actually you took part in, where we heard from JP Morgan, for example, about the project at that bank for setting enterprise standards for software quality, which seems to be a very important trend among larger financial firms. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. So, hi, first off, I'm Steve Feloney. I'm head of products for our DevOps solutions here at Broadcom. I've been in the testing space for, well, I guess I'll just say it, over 20 years. Makes me sound really old when I say that. But yeah, so I've been around for quite a while, and I've seen the evolution of testing, especially in large firms, financial firms, and I've seen the changes and how things have evolved there. Now, one of the things that in that session that I was involved in was, well, creating the standards, but also like how standards like change management and things of that nature. And there's been an evolution, or there is going through an evolution. It used to be that people had these CMDBs, these change management databases, where when they were doing the releases, they had everything in this change management. So they understood everything that was about to go into production. And then when it went into production, they could manage it, and they knew everything that was in this change management. And then you had the CMDB, but then the CMDB wasn't enough because it was too localized. So then you ended up having these UCMDBs, which were the universal change management. So you had your local one, then you had a universal one. But it's really hard nowadays to maintain a system as complex as that when you're not releasing once a year. You're releasing every day. You're releasing every week. You're releasing every 2 weeks. No matter what speed that people are releasing at, they're releasing at a significantly faster pace than they used to. And what they need is they need a way of, one, understanding who has the rights to deploy into production. Right? That is one thing. Obviously, there's the governance piece of who has those. And then what gets deployed, they still need to know what's gotten deployed. They need to know how to rectify the situation, but it needs to be in a much simpler fashion. It can't be necessarily in a separate tool. You want it to flow, right? What you're seeing now, you hear about all the pipelines. So you have the developers are doing their things. There's testers in the development groups. There's end-to-end testing that goes on. There's deployment into production, and it's value stream. You have this value stream management, and part of that management is the changes that are going on. And what they need to understand is what's the change, who's made the change, and what can I do if I make this change? Can I roll back this change? Am I forced to roll forward? Because if I'm making a massive database change, I need to know that the rollback is just not the option. So I need to understand these things, but I need to understand and to make sure that only the people that actually have that ability to do the change are making the change. So a challenge that we've run into, especially in financial institutions, is when we're going into development groups, and development groups want to deploy every day. Well, based on regulations, they're not allowed to. And so now you end up having a step involved where you're still trying to deploy. So the developers sort of release the software, and then yet another person who has that responsibility is the one who has to make it so, even though they're trying to do it as rapidly as possible. So there's conflicts there, and it's not just a matter of deploying the applications, but it's also how are you monitoring the applications that go into production. So you need to understand those changes as well, because it's not all right. So I changed my system, so I changed a configuration that went out that I deployed, or I changed a service that I deployed, but how have I changed the monitoring of those systems as well? Because I need to understand who's monitoring it, who has the rights to actually monitor it, and then how am I going to get the information back to the people that need it as quickly as possible. So there's a lot of things that are involved in the change management, but when it comes down to, you're saying a standardization, like that was one of the part of the question you asked was the standardization. Is it's easier if it was more standardized, but I think it's instead of working on the overall standardization, it's just more of making sure you have the right level of log and right level of governance before you can do those deployments. Alex, your thoughts?
Yeah, that's as you talked about. That's a very complex area that's ever evolving. And by the way, I'm Alex Martens. I head up our solution engineering organization for the financial services vertical here at Broadcom. And like Steve, have about 20 or so years in the testing space. My background has been mostly on the service providers side of the world, and also being a customer myself, using software tools to help us through the software quality practices and development. So with background, I've followed and I've implemented many of those transformations right across different financial services and other industries as well. And just to kind of add to what Steve was mentioning, I think another very critical aspect of this evolution that we're seeing around configurations and the pipeline and all that is the fact that now that we are producing all of this data, right, as part of that new SDLC, that new software development lifecycle, people are asking us more about what can they use that data for, right? So hey, we're capturing all data for, we have requirements tied to these pieces of code, right, to these functions, and it's all tied together. Great. It's not easy to get to that point, but we got to that point. Now we're checking in. We know we're checking this new change into and tagging that against a certain user story or whatever, however you're doing your requirements, and then this is going to be deployed in this environment, and then you're going to run these tests in an automated fashion, right, all through CI. But what can we do with all that data, right? What are the insights that we can start gaining from all the data? And that's where many of our customers are asking us to help them define new areas to be explored, such as, for example, I know that every time this particular part of the application is changed, I know usually it breaks something on this other part of the application. So how can we use that information, right?
Mhm.
If we boost our regression suite, our regression testing suite, and make sure that particular area is very well tested, so we can catch that even at upon check-in, not even deployment, right? What can we do? Like if we know that this developer, when he's assigned to work on this part of the application, this developer usually has some more rework, right? Usually he does multiple rounds of iterations to.
Alex always blames the developer. He always says it's the developer's fault.
No, that was in the past. Part of the evolution of ourselves, right? We're now friends. We're brothers. So like those insights are things, sort of the next frontier that we're seeing a lot of our financial services customers try to get to. And obviously, as Steve was saying, that's extremely hard, especially in a highly regulated environment, because how do you do all those things, gain all those insights, and get actionable next steps when you have to satisfy all of those audit requirements and regulations and all that. So it's an extra layer of complexity that we certainly see our customers having to deal with, and we spend a lot of time trying to help.
So change management, a huge challenge for financial firms, large and small. But value stream management, perhaps just to establish one takeaway, is part of the answer. Attributing practice, working out where change is making a difference. So just before we leave that point, what is it that you are telling your customers they can do as a first step to this? I mean, is this an out-of-the-box solution? Stephen?
I wouldn't say it's an out-of-the-box solution, but what we are saying for our customers is a fewfold. One, you want to get a proper pipeline. So it's not just a build pipeline. You need a proper pipeline so you have visibility into what's happening. So if you don't have the visibility, everything else is going to fail. So you need that visibility. Now, once you get the visibility, then the other thing that you need to start to work on is, I don't want to say AI and ML, but let's just call it actionable insights. Oh, actual AI, actionable insights. Sorry, didn't mean that. Just came out. So to have to get the data now, so in order to do that data, now you have to have these integration points between your different tool sets to get that actionable data, because part of the change management is to understand what is the risk of that change. And as Alex was pointing out, having that data. So that's why it's not out of the box, because it's not all one system. As much as like we at Broadcom would love every customer to use all of our tools, then it would be very close to being out of the box. But you have your own tools. And so those integration points have to happen. But once you get those integration points and you have a visibility across the pipeline, from the time that you've created your requirements or your user stories or your work items, whatever you want to call it, having that visibility to how long is it taking to get it into development, how long is it taking to get out the door, and then what are the challenges every time these requirements, these user stories, this block of code changes, this development group touches the code, this QA team or this tester group inside this. Once you have all this information, now you can help minimize the risk in the change.
Yeah.
And that's one of the big things. One, there's change management and what do you do and how do you fix things and how do you know where the problems are? But the other side of that is, how do I minimize my risk for every change that I'm doing, especially when I'm going very rapid? And so having the pipeline, having the visibility, and getting the data, those are I would say that the three big things that you start with.
And this risk minimization theme very much in tune with what regulators want in terms of standards for operational resilience. Tell us, I mean, the challenges are the same. Are they for large firms and smaller firms in this massive transition? Or, because we hear a lot from the big players about the difficulty of achieving simplicity at scale. But presumably for the smaller firms, the regional banks, for example, the challenge is where to start.
So are they the same challenges? I find they are the same challenges. It's just a matter of scale for the challenges. Now, what I find is there's also a level of inertia that the larger firms might have to overcome. There is one company, I won't mention the name, but a large company. Almost every time we go in there and we talk to them, there's always security concerns. We can't go to cloud. We can't do this. We can't have this data. We can't, it's all security regulations. They throw every single regulation out at us, right? We can't do this, can't do this. All right. They bought a small fintech company, small fintech company. All of a sudden, that company, boom, doesn't really matter what's going on. We can use that. We can use that public cloud. We have this thing that we're doing to protect this data over here. We're good. So they have the same regulations. They have to follow the same rules. Yet the one company doesn't have the, I don't know if it's the security bureaucracy or the security concerns where they're able to move forward much faster. It's now the same company, but you see the difference between the large and the small. And so I think it's a matter of mentality as to what they can and cannot do based upon their legacy.
Yeah.
I don't know, Alex, if you...
Yeah, no, I agree. And as a matter of fact, what we see a lot of when they buy a fintech, the large ones buy a fintech, we see them trying to leverage those great practices, right? And great culture, quite frankly, to accelerate and to basically modernize the legacy side of the organization. And it's not always easy. I mean, it's never easy. Let's put it that way. It's never easy. But we do see that intention being applied to those situations. Now, when we work with smaller banks, like you were saying, the regional banks, even some fintechs, I agree with Steve. I mean, the problems or the challenges rather are the same, but the scale is infinitely different. And because of that inertia, as Steve was saying, the smaller organizations are able to try things faster, right? Mm-hmm. They still are afraid and they still have the regulations hovering over their heads, but they are faster at trying and tweaking and trying again, as opposed to a large financial services company that has lots of layers and there's a lot of politics, right? Sometimes there's a great group doing something here and then there's another group that does things very traditionally, and like you don't want to upset each other. There's a lot of that, a lot more of that in the larger firms. So that's why you see them usually going much slower than the more nimble ones.
And I would say it's generally the thought is it's safer to say no.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Right. If I say yes and something fails, that's bad. But if I say no, nothing fails.
Yeah.
Now, maybe they lose customers, but it's not a direct impact. They can't see that, right? They can't see that they might lose customers, make customers unhappy and all that. But if I say no, it's safer than saying yes. And so I think that's another problem, because the larger the bank, the larger the firm, the financial firm, the larger the exposure.
Yeah. I'm often surprised by, I am surprised by how often the issue of cultural change and the difficulty of cultural change comes up when people speak at our conferences and events, when we get feedback from our audiences on the obstacles they're facing. It's taking people with you, it's making those decisions is often, the problem. You mentioned, Stephen,
but one thing though, but I have seen, and I don't know if this is universal, I have seen, and I agree with Alex, when you have the larger firms buy a smaller, more, like, let's say nimble or fintech, something like that, I have seen that influence the culture of the larger firm. It's easier for the larger firm to change than if they don't buy that other company. Because if they do it just themselves, it's their own inertia. It's everything else they have to fight. But when they bring fresh blood in, that definitely helps.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true across many industries. You mentioned data. And Stephen, this was an issue that comes up time again throughout the series that we're just completing. The challenge in particular of connecting data lakes to test environments, of creating an enterprise strategy for data that includes data requirements for testing and software development. And a lot of people asking us in these events about the value of virtualization technologies, synthetic data test service virtualization. They love the idea, but they're worried about the cost and the maintenance cost and the effort and time involved. And it's a great example of one of the difficulties in shifting left to moving to DevOps, from moving from waterfall to agile and other new ways of working. Is this technology going to deliver the ROI I need? I'd really like to hear what you have to say about data.
Sure. I mean, data has always been a big problem. Like in my 20 plus years, data has always been a problem. Data now has, and I'll say recently, within the last year, data is now taking a much larger, it's in the forefront of people's minds. And one of the reasons for that is now we have all these agile teams, all trying to do their own testing, trying to get the stuff done where we've decentralized. And now all these teams are like, well, I can't test. I don't have the data. Where before they'd be writing the code, they would do, a unit test here or there. They'd throw it off to a QA team. The QA team would then have the time. They'd work with production. They'd work with whatever. They'd get the data. But now all that's gone. You can't do that anymore. So now you have to get data quickly. And you're asking about the ROI. I would say let's focus on a few things on what do people need when it comes time for data. If I'm looking at an agile team, and it doesn't matter if they're safe, if they're a scrum team, if they're a squad, whatever. If I'm looking at these teams, they are testing a service. They're testing a component. They're testing an API. They're not testing the whole application. They're testing their thing. They need small amounts of data, and they don't need all that data from production. They don't need to understand how every single database in production interacts with each other. They don't need that complexity. So they don't need to pull in this virtualized system or whole gold copies of data. And that's a challenge that they have. They can use synthetic data. They understand the types of data, the inputs and outputs of their service. They might need some virtualization of virtual services. So they might need to virtualize around what they're testing, but they can use synthetic data in order to manage that. Now, a challenge still that they'll have is how to keep all that data in sync. Because it's not just getting the data. I have data to drive a test. I have data for virtual services. I have data for systems under test. I like how I put my hand under my desk for systems under test. That's excellent. So you have all that. So you still have a synchronization issue that you have to happen. But life becomes so much easier when you talk about synthetic data for that. And then as you progress forward, sure, if you go to your end-to-end testing and you need to understand all the complexities of how all the data connects in behind the scenes because you have a very complex legacy application you have to test, then you have to go into like a test management solution. Now, is that hard? Is there work? There's work involved, right? You have to understand the complexities. You have to understand how all the data interacts. You have to build that together. And you said, well, what's the ROI? Basically, I'll put it another way: is the juice worth the squeeze on that? Well, what are your other options? Your other options are you push that off to the test data guy that's in production, and you keep having to ask him to get the data, and then you use the excuse, oh well, he can't get me the data for another month. It takes me a year in order to refresh my data, right? That's how long does that take? I just said it took a year, 6 months.
Yeah.
So the time it takes to engineer, work out how to get the test data management solution to work, you're going to be better off in the long run. There is going to take effort up front in order to do those things. But I should really just keep a picture and just flash it all the time of the guy who's pushing the cart down with the square wheels, and he's got to get to market, right? And he's pushing this down. This guy comes down with a round wheel. Hey, I have something to help you out. I don't have time. Don't have time. I got to get this done. Yes, he has to stop the cart. He's got to pick the cart up. Someone's got to help him pull the wheels off. It's going to take time. That's going to take effort. But once you get those round wheels on, boom, that baby's moving. So there is that effort up front, but it's definitely going to be worth it in the long run, because then you can have your testers on demand. Think about that. Testers on demand. I need this data. Boom, done. I don't have to waste all this time. I can get the data when I need the data. And then once you have it separated out, the agile teams, they need the synthetic data. The end-to-end teams, they need the full end-to-end solution. You can have all that integrated together to keep everything in sync, and that's what's needed. So yes, there's complexities involved, but it's definitely worth it. In the long run, it's definitely worth it.
And Alex, this challenge around data, of course, is happening in the context of the transition to the cloud, the public cloud, that a lot of firms, a lot of your clients are undergoing. That's the even bigger challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And when we see these app migration initiatives, right, to the cloud, we usually see some level of re-architecture going on, right, to simplify those problems in the legacy within the legacy applications. Because, like Steve was saying, when you get to a point where you're doing end-to-end testing, right, just before production, you need to have a very accurate idea of how all of your applications communicate, so that you can actually go through those flows and make sure you're being able to traverse the entire value stream from an end-to-end perspective. But as they migrate applications to the cloud, usually there is some level. In some cases, they completely re-architect the entire application stack in order to decouple everything and make that test data problem much simpler to tackle, right, and maintain and all that. But in the cases where you're not going through any of that effort, any of that refactoring or re-architecture effort, the main challenge that I see, or the main pushback around the ROI that you were talking about, is really that, the solutions available out there, they still require me to do a ton of effort. And today, I don't have, whoever set up all the data, the databases in our company, the ones that have set up the schemas and all that, all those people are gone, right? And then your tools, or the tools out there, are unable to magically tell me how my business is run, right? So it's kind of one of those things that, it's a very complex problem to tackle. There is the fact that these systems have been up and running for years, and they're very reliable.
Decades.
And now you're trying to think about virtualization. You're trying to think about how can I optimize my SDLC. But for that to happen, you need that institutional knowledge that, in a lot of cases in these large firms, is no longer there. So that is the first pushback that we get against that ROI, right? The effort we're going to have to put in is so massive, because not even this team understands how those applications communicate behind the scenes. So it's something like Steve said, like, you have to take a step back so that you can jump, you can leap.
Yeah. I mean, I do hear quite often the complaint from heads of QA, heads of dev, heads of engineering. Well, the time frame of the CTO is 18 months. That's the time frame over which he or she wants to see the ROI, and they're expecting very quick returns upfront from automation technologies. Do you agree with that? That's the
in fact, one of the main things we try to help our customers with is kind of internalizing the fact that, hey, we don't need to design a full solution that's going to solve all of the use cases from day one, right?
That's right.
Usually, if you show quick value, right, quick time to value on 1 or 2 or even 3 use cases, let's say within 6 weeks, within 12 weeks, you show some gains, right? It took us, 3 days to set up the test. Now it's like, a couple of hours or even minutes, right? That's huge gains. And then you can gain momentum, and then you get into that place where people, even, your C-level leader is kind of saying, they're actually making a lot of progress. Let me give them more time. Let me give me more money, right? Whatever it is, because you are showing that quick value, as opposed to how we find in many of these more traditional firms, they're more like, no, I can't take the first step unless I know the entire map to get me where I need to be. And that's a cultural thing, right?
Yeah, and like, if we go back to just the test data, You don't have to map every single aspect of every single piece of data across every single database. You have a specific, say, business flow that you're caring about, say a certain requirement.
Yeah.
Fine, just target that for right now. Same thing if you're trying to have your test auto-created, so you're modeling a requirement, right? You don't have to model the entire application. Model the requirement. Move forward. Take little steps, and those little steps will get you a long way. Don't be bogged down with your end goal, and that end goal may be a very long way away, but 18 months, you should see ROI significantly faster than 18 months.
That's
significantly faster than 18 months.
Very optimistic message. Now, a final question from me. Obviously, over the course of this series, the past 3 months, the impact of COVID has been something very
COVID? What
uppermost
about?
In the minds of our participants. And of course, the demands of security for home working have perhaps overshadowed, other plans. But also, we've seen a lot of acceleration of demand for digital services from customers, and at the same time, a lot of firms challenged by performance. In particular, we've seen that at leading stock exchanges, and we've seen it at small retailers and everybody else in between. What would be the one or two lessons you'd like to highlight, Stephen and Alex, from this? Well, it's a year now of COVID.
Well, all right. So when it comes to, say, well, I'll say this. When it comes to the year of COVID, I'd say I think most companies, most technology organizations did actually fairly well. I'm actually quite impressed at how fast people were able to turn, whether it's getting their employees to work from home or whether it's they were able to handle the massive load. Now, are there performance problems? Yes. Do companies need to do better at their performance testing, or ensuring that as they go on these cloud services that they have the ability to scale better and faster than they are? Sure. Those are things that they have to do. And performance is becoming a bigger and bigger issue because, as you mentioned, there's more and more and more people doing online services. And you're seeing financial institutions come out with more features for the online services because people can't go in to the areas anymore, in the businesses anymore. So clearly, when it comes to performance, I guess the one thing I would say from performance, and one, people were caught off guard at the beginning of COVID, so you can almost, give them a break for that. But don't wait to do your performance testing before you release. We still see this as a big problem. When we talked about the shift left, we talked about shift lefting in testing. They shift left maybe some of the functional testing. Now, we know the shifting left hasn't completely fully happened, right? You have your API testing, your unit testing, your performance testing, your GUI functional test. There's so many things that have to get done in that team. But one of the things that is lacking is the performance testing in those teams. There's still, even when I say, oh, there's no COE, there's still a performance COE, right? Those teams, those agile teams, have to think about, and I hate saying the non-functional requirements because it pains me as a performance tester. You have to think about performance testing. That has to be in the forefront, because just because something functions, who cares? If it doesn't perform, it's just as bad as if it doesn't function, because it's not functioning right if it's not performing. So I would say get them to start doing performance testing early on, just like they're doing their unit testing.
And Alex, a final word from you.
Yeah, and the one thing I would say would be, as you are relying on the cloud now, right? Many of these financial services firms have, throughout the pandemic, I mean, they had to learn how to move workloads to the cloud, right? And so with that, they had to learn how to even work in the cloud, right? How an application should be configured to run in the cloud. But as they were doing that, as they were going through that learning process, they had this misconception that, the cloud will auto scale, the cloud will handle spikes in my workloads and additional users and all that, I don't need to do anything, right? Or if I need to do it, it's probably the last thing I should worry about. That's the misconception. And then because of that, they'll go, oh, actually don't need as much performance tests as I used to need when I had my own infrastructure. And that's completely incorrect. And we've seen many of these large financial firms crash and burn because of that, as they were moving to the cloud thinking was going to improve their business when it actually had a reverse effect. So just watch out for that.
Well, Stephen, Alex, thank you very much for joining me for this conversation. I think you've done a great job summarizing not just the themes that came up in our series, but the challenges that financial firms are facing right across the board at this very exciting time. Thank you, and thank you for your support.
Thank you very much.